I just ask you to give your names and your positions for the benefit of the tape?
Sure. Shall I go first? Alphabetically, Jeff Barton. I'm General Secretary of the Association of School and College Leaders, representing 19,500 school and college leaders across the UK.
Thank you.
Good morning, I'm Carol Liddon. I'm the Managing Director of Children's Services at Action for Children. We support 380,000 children and young people across the UK.
I'm Mark Russell. I'm the Chief Executive of the Children's Society, and I lead a team of people working with thousands of young people across the country.
That's great. Okay, thank you very much indeed for that. If I could just start off, are you all right if we call you by your first names?
Yes.
Thank you, and please, you're very happy if you do the same to us. Jeff, do you mind if I just kick off and ask you what you thought of Lord Adonis's comments about that the online learning provided by schools is poor and there's not enough of it being done? He's been quite criticised over the weekend. I just wondered if you'd had any comments on that.
Yeah, I mean, I received a lot of comments from members who thought it was ill-judged. I think during this unprecedented period, we're trying very much to have a spirit of generosity. Now, I think we will look back and know that there was always going to be inconsistencies in terms of the provision of what schools were able to do, particularly given that they were closing down with 2 or 3 days notice. And actually, I think there's been an extraordinary effort by the majority of schools to try and put in place some of those resources. And I don't know what the evidence base was that Lord Adonis was using, but I do think that it felt a bit of a sideswipe, a profession which is trying very hard, I think, to put resources out there. And also, I think we must remind ourselves that ultimately it isn't just about digital resources. The advantage and the disadvantage gap is actually about other things. It's about the kind of household you live in, the number of books you've got and all of that. And I thought, therefore, he focused on a narrow, slightly cheap point there, which actually left a lot of people feeling undermined and a bit more undervalued.
First, I should have begun by thanking all your members and support staff, teachers, heads in schools for doing a remarkable job and putting their own health at risk and that of their families by coming in to look after children of critical workers and key workers. So I think it's very much understood that teachers and heads and support staff are doing everything they can to help vulnerable children and children of critical workers. But can I just ask you, the Times newspaper today, again, if I could just direct this, Jeff, suggests that a quarter of A-level students preparing to go to university are not being given any work to do by their schools. And I think this is from the Sutton Trust that have done this study, and that's it is from the Sutton Trust, and it's a huge difference compared to private schools. Can I ask you just to comment on that? And would you recognise that as an accurate survey or not? And if so, if you do recognise it as accurate, why would that be happening?
Well, I think what I'd say first of all in response is that what schools and colleges are doing is trying to work on different fronts for very different cohorts. And if you think about those children who were in year 11 who would have now been about to start entering the exam season, or in year 13 about to start their A-levels, there was a very clear directive from Ofqual following the Secretary of State saying the exams won't take place, that actually no additional work would be taken into account for this year's examination. So the things that I would have been doing as an English teacher to prepare my young people for their exams, the recommendation was that cannot be taken into account. You take into account what they've done so far. Now, that's not to say those young people shouldn't have some work, and particularly with the year 11s, where it's easier for us, if we're in 11 to 18 school, to be able to set them work to prepare them for their A-levels, because that's 11 to 18 school in our control. If you've got year 13 students who were going to go off to a university course to do medicine or whatever it might be, it seems to me it would be easier for the universities to make available a range of different appropriate resources so that those students who were going to transition into higher education were starting to do some reading around there. Now, my guess is some schools will have started to do that, I think, but I'd go back to my opening comment. They're working on many fronts, trying to do their best for a whole range of students, particularly the most vulnerable.
Could you just move slightly back because I can only see a bit of your head? That's
a bonus, most would say.
Yeah, yeah, just that's better because half of you was coming up on my screen. But just to say, do you recognise? Would you say the Sutton report is accurate? And just can you just encapsulate, if it is accurate, why is this the case?
Well, I think it's probably got some validity. Sutton Trust is bringing out various insights at the moment. I think all I would say is that if you're ahead in a school which has got year 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 and 13, and you're trying to put online learning resources there, the most difficult for you to provide will be the year 13s, who will be waiting to get their A-level results in August, upon which they will then go, in most cases, to higher education. And what is beyond our control is what that course might look like, what the curriculum in higher education might look like. Now, I think probably what some schools will have said to their young people is, think about the degree or the qualification that you are going to go on and study. Here are some things you could be reading around it. I'd like to think that's probably happening, but I think there are so many different elements to this in such a short time that the Sutton Trust probably has highlighted something which we'll probably need to give some attention to.
And should every school be offering some kind of online learning, particularly given the Oak Academy, the Google offering, the BBC offering? Should it be requirements of every school to make sure that their pupils have at least some kind of online learning from home or not? And
I think that's where the Lord Adoni's comments were unhelpful in a sense, because it seems to me that there is a very large disparity in terms of what different schools will already have had in place. If you're a primary school in Cumbria versus a large multi-academy trust, for example, it might be that the level of investment in a digital curriculum is very, very different. But the whole point of the Oak Academy, and indeed of the BBC stepping up with its bite size, has allowed you, if you are the Cumbrian primary school, to be able to say to parents, there are a range of different resources here. Now, I worked with Matt Hood and the people at the Oak Academy in order to send out the message that ultimately what you don't want is a pick and mix of different activities that children kind of jump through. So they're doing Carol Vorderman maths here, and then they're doing Joe Wicks here, that the curriculum should be defined by the school. And what we've said to our members is, remind your parents that it's the teachers who are the experts in this. There will be some resources online they can use, such as the Oak Academy, such as the BBC resources and other things, but also there are other things they should be doing. They should be doing physical exercise, they should be doing some reading.
Should schools be offering every school be offering some kind of online learning platform for their pupils?
They should be offering parents access to various online learning platforms. So in other words, directing parents to which of the resources on the Oak Academy or the BBC are most appropriate, if they haven't already got a range of their own.
Okay, and if they're not doing this, what should happen? Is there a way of measuring this? Is this what Lord Adonis is talking about, or has he just got the wrong end of the stick?
I don't know. I don't know what his evidence base was. I mean, my evidence base from the members I talked to is I don't know any school which isn't on a regular basis sending something out to parents saying these are the activities as part of our planned curriculum that your youngster should do. But notice I'm making the distinction that sometimes that will be directing those parents to take their children to resources created by other people, whether it's the Oak Academy, whether it's the BBC, whether it's the range of other things out there. That responsibility to inform parents and support parents, I think, is something that all of our members would have taken seriously.
One primary school head said to me, it's a very good school, that one of the reasons why she was very cautious about providing Zoom platforms and online is because there are a lot of homes and she doesn't know what's going on in the homes, who's going to access it. Would it be an open door to, God forbid, online harms, predators and so on? Do you have a view about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is pretty uncharted territory, of course, but our advice to members who've asked about that, because there was some expectation coming from some areas that you would kind of teach your subject through Zoom in live time to a group of young people. We think that is problematic because the security of platforms cannot be guaranteed. And if you're going to do that, what we would say is you record yourself as a teacher and then you post it. And therefore it's not interactive in the same way, but it does mean you can control what happens and what it is that those young people are actually seeing.
And further to that, and maybe the others would like to comment. Again, there's a report in the Daily Telegraph today suggesting that almost half of under 16s were exposed to harmful web content during the shutdown. There's an organisation in my constituency I register that I know them very well, called the Safeguarding Alliance. You may have come across them. They talk about a new frontier of vulnerable children and exposed to new online harms, maybe who aren't on the existing list of vulnerable children, and potentially that's very dangerous. I mean, if half of under 16s have viewed harmful content online during the lockdown, and that's according to Britain's official censor, that is extremely worrying, and just wondered what your views are on what should be, if there is anything that can be done about it.
Well, just a couple of things on that. I mean, it is deeply disturbing if that's the case, and that's why I'd probably make 2 points. One is that the kind of learning that children do at home may in part be online, but we shouldn't think that that is the only way learning is going to happen. If this just happened 20 years ago, for example, then there would be no access to online learning, and yet we would still be expecting things to happen at home. And so I think that's where the Lord Adonis comment that the only way children are going to learn is through online learning actually takes us into a bit of a cul-de-sac. My second point is that what this probably gives us a reminder of is the responsibility of parents and carers at home, that it's part of their responsibility to be able to help teach their children how they are using that. Now, that will have been happening as part of the school curriculum, part of PSHE and so on, but I suspect we're going to need to step up our guidance to parents that it isn't enough simply to leave your child to be looking at who knows what all day, that there has to be some sense of responsibility, just like you take responsibility for whether they're leaving the house and where they're going in more normal times.
And would the other two like to comment on that, please?
I think the risks to children online have increased, particularly those children that are particularly isolated. So if they're an only child and they're playing online games and things like that, then there will be an increased risk. There is no doubt about that. And parents, do take seriously their responsibilities generally to look after their children and make sure that they are monitoring their online activity. But these are unprecedented times, and parents are under a lot of pressure, particularly the families that we work with, and actually having the time and the space and the wherewithal to just constantly monitor is a challenge, and children will be at risk. There is no doubt about that.
And Mark?
I'm happy to concur with everything that Carol's just said for benefit of time.
Okay. If I could just ask you one final question before I pass to my colleagues. What do you think of the government measures to help the vulnerable, so far vulnerable children, and what is missing in all this? Because we know that only 5% of children, vulnerable children, are going to school at this present time. We know about new safeguarding threats, which we've just talked about. I don't know if Jeff is still there.
Yeah.
You've gone. Your screen has gone funny. But do you want to, who wants to comment first? Maybe we'll bring you in, Mark, first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm very happy to comment on that. I mean, we've welcomed the government's moves around free school meals, and but we do want to point out that there are significant implementation difficulties with those on the ground. Our staff are reporting that students who have, or pupils who have free school meal vouchers, frequently they're for supermarkets that aren't anywhere near where they live. We've particularly where you've got children from different schools within one family. It's particularly acute for children with special needs, who often live further away from the school. And we would really want to encourage the government to rethink whether or not cash payments might be the best way forward for this. I also want to welcome the extension of free school meals to pupils who have no recourse to public funding, but do want to point out that actually that is only one small part of the immense need that those particular pupils have, and to encourage the government to lift that NRPF condition more generally, to help families who are struggling immensely at this particular time financially.
Thank you. Carol?
I would concur with everything that Mark has said, and we're seeing similar evidence that families are really struggling. In fact, families are saying to us that the vouchers aren't worth the money that they're written on, because they just can't get to the supermarkets because they're at a long distance from where they live.
So we're going to come on to
Robert, would you mind if I just comment on one thing there? It's Jeff here.
Yeah, we're going to talk about food and vouchers quite a bit in a bit, but I want to just focus on the general, apart from the food vouchers, and my colleagues will ask quite a few questions on that in a minute, but I'm just talking about the general measures that the government have done to help the vulnerable, what is missing in this, and what should be done.
Sorry, just to make one comment, it is just about the notion of vulnerable children. What we found with the decision for schools to close at short notice was that there were these two categories. And so if you were the child of your mum was a doctor or your dad was a nurse, you were part of a national mission, and you could see why those young people found it easy to go into school. The problem with using the term vulnerable, I think, is there was lots of different perception as what it meant. And of course, it's kind of contradicted by the wider narrative, which is if you are vulnerable, you should be staying at home and self-isolating. And I think at the beginning of this process, we weren't clear enough on who are the children who we are talking about, who should be a priority. And what we did over the Easter holiday with members is to say, as the term re-begins and people start talking about a curriculum again, this is the opportunity to get those children and bring them back in. And a lot of them haven't had the best relationship in the past with schools, but I think the fact that we are seeing an increase there is significant. And we're doing a webinar on Wednesday about reaching out to vulnerable children, because we are on an absolute mission that we don't want to look back and think that the children who most needed education in school rather than being at home are ones where any of us turned a blind eye to them.
And do we need a catch-up premium to help those children who haven't been getting any type of education the past few weeks?
I think lots of people are making lots of suggestions about lots of things, and of all the things that are being suggested, it is the catch-up premium I think that we would welcome the most, because what that then does is to A, recognise that there is an issue for those young people, but B, it then allows the school or the college to decide what is the right course of action. And that, it seems to me, is going to be very significant, rather like the Chief Inspector was saying to you last week. What we don't want is a cavalry of different people rushing in to do mentoring and one-to-one coaching and so on and so forth. It needs to be controlled by the school as to what's appropriate, so we can do the most important thing, which is to allow teachers and teaching assistants to focus on those individual young people.
And whilst it's understood that the schools won't be open in the summer, the teachers have an enormous burden. They've had an enormous burden and will have in preparing the next year. Should there be perhaps summer schools, as in the school buildings open, and you would have some kind of extra tuition and catch up, perhaps provided by external charities or retired teachers, to help those left behind pupils over the summer catch up?
I think once again, it's an idea which at this stage feels attractive. I think the reality is, as someone who's an English teacher for 32 years, is that at some point what we will need to do is to start by actually assessing what have those children not learned, where are they, so that we can then diagnostically start to fill those gaps and build the knowledge. And it's difficult to see how a retired teacher, someone who's a university student who's not perhaps au fait with the curriculum, will do more than provide some activities. That may be useful, but I don't think we should delude ourselves that that is going to do the job that the teacher will do once they reconnect with those young people.
Although if you take, let's say, the Action, I think it's Action on Tutoring, a charity, they say just something like an extra 10 to 20 hours can advance a child's, in maths and English, can advance them by a good few months, and their grade goes up by a half, in terms of helping disadvantaged pupils.
Well, we know from the Education Endowment Foundation that the element that makes the biggest difference is one-to-one or small group teaching. But I go back to my point that needs to be done after the assessment of what that teacher needs, and what the idea of pupil premium would then allow is for those extra resources, the extra catch-up either at lunchtime or after school, to be directed within the school, within the framework of what the child is learning. So we welcome the principle. I think it's probably about who does it and the timing of when it happens.
And is your union doing, or is it able to, will you be relying on external organisations to examine how far left behind these left behind pupils are during this time?
Yeah, that will be something for external organisations. We will obviously be talking to our members, because what members are hearing from the teachers and the children who are in, say, year 10, so halfway through their GCSEs, or year 12, halfway through their A-levels, is will amends be taken in terms of the content they may not have got, or how they're going to be assessed. Now, that's something we will take a very active interest in and talking with Ofqual about, but the actual evaluation overall we would leave to other experts.
Thank you. I'm going to bring Ian Mearns in, please. Thank you, all of you.
Very grateful, Chair. Jeff, on the research by the Sutton Trust and the comments of Lord Adonis, who, if he has got the wrong end of the stick, it wouldn't be the first time from my perspective. Can I ask what specific advice that ASCL is actually giving to head teachers about keeping in touch with all children at the moment?
Well, we're saying two things. We're saying, first of all, I was taught that leadership is 90% communication, 10% doing things, 90% explaining what you're doing, why you're doing it. And at this very fragmented time, to stay in touch with parents, to give parents the sense that the school remains the hub of the community and the teacher is the person who knows best, means that you should be sending something home to that family on a frequent basis. And I think most of our members are doing weekly emails, sometimes video bulletins, to help the parent to navigate what their child might be doing. But secondly, through risk assessments of those vulnerable children in particular, what we've got are schools who are making contact with those youngsters, even if they can't bring them into school because the child feels stigmatized by it or whatever it might be, to actually check on those children, ask how they're doing, and do everything you can. And so whether it's contact with the parent or with the youngster directly, in addition to the teaching resources being sent out, that I think probably characterizes what members are doing.
And secondly, on that issue, the finding by the Sutton Trust, and okay, I haven't had time to read the report in detail, but their suggestion that 25% of students studying for A-levels are getting no work from their schools. Now, there might be a rationale for that if they are the children who are young, or the young people who are already predicted to get the grades that they want to get into the universities that they want. But wouldn't it still be advisable for schools in those sort of circumstances with those sorts of young people to be giving those young people lessons and information about how to engage with independent learning to prepare them for university?
Yes, I'd agree, but I just make the distinction between the needs of year 12, who we will be particularly concerned about because they're halfway through their A-levels, they will be worrying about how they're going to be assessed. Schools will undoubtedly be making sure that as far as they can give the resources for the curriculum those young people would be working towards, that will be continuing. More difficult, it's not to say impossible, but more difficult is what you do for those year 13 students who don't know what grades they've got yet, don't therefore know what their pathways will be beyond the sixth form. I think you're absolutely right that actually to be able to encourage them to do the reading around the subject and what they might study is something that would be a good thing. But you can see it's slightly different from having a curriculum ready-made which you can send out to those young people.
Thank you.
Ian, just 1 second. Before I bring you on the free school meals, I think Tom wants to ask a specific question on this point. Tom.
Okay, that's good. Hopefully you can hear me now. Yes, it is on that Sutton Trust data again. I mean, I don't think it's unreasonable for a number of us to have quite significant concerns when the Sutton Trust, which is a very respected organisation, publishes a report saying that only 23% of school children are taking part in online lessons every day. And I actually referred to this this stat in a local opinion piece that I wrote last week. And in response to that, I had a whole number of local teachers from Suffolk contacting me to say that they find this very strange because, in their school, it's sort of 80-90% attendance. So, but I kind of responded to that in a way that makes me even more concerned because, if we trust this Sutton Trust data and it's a decent evidence base and it's saying 23%, and then some of the schools that are on it are sort of getting 80-90%, then it would imply that there are a pocket of schools where it's incredibly low, and almost virtually no children are getting online tuition every day. So, and it does strike me that, you know, if you go for a period of 2 or 3 months where you've had no online engagement at all, it really does concern me. And I know that the Chief Inspector from Ofsted has said that nothing that happens during this period will be reflected in any future inspections. Well, to my mind, it's quite irresponsible. I mean, I know that the parents have a role as well, but so do the schools. And I think if a school isn't taking steps to try and drive up attendance rates during this period, I think that's a neglection of duty.
Yeah, well, I haven't got the Sutton Trust in front of me. If it is about what is the school itself directly providing with its own learning platform, the distinction I'm making is that what you will find is that what some schools are doing, who don't have a very sophisticated learning platform, is directing people to be able to look at other resources out there. Now, it might be the Sutton Trust would say that's what we were analysing. That's not the way I read it. And certainly what I also know is that what schools are doing is recognising that there are families in their communities who don't have any access to that, who've stopped paying their broadband and so on. And what those schools are doing is sending out packs of material to those young people, past papers and stuff. Now, we can't guarantee what those children will be doing and how much they will be doing around it. But I think there is no sense at all of school leaders wanting to either turn a blind eye or abdicate responsibility to any of this. It's just that we will look back and see that the inconsistencies in what schools have been able to provide, because it's not really been a national strategy to put in place a curriculum online for every school everywhere, that is something which we are going to have to address as soon as we finish all of this.
Mr. Chair, can I make a point on that, please?
Sure.
Just to say that issues around digital deprivation for some children are very significant here. And I mean, the government have announced a package of measures to get IT kit to disadvantaged young people, and we welcome that completely. That kit hasn't gone out yet, and we were told it was 2 weeks. It's still 2 weeks before that kit will go out. And I think if you're living in a family where you already have poor access to the internet, maybe you're in a rural area, maybe you haven't got the right IT kit, then it's really hard for those children to participate in online learning.
Can I just make the point, though? I'm absolutely understood about the digital divide, and I've been talking about it for the past few weeks, and it worries me greatly. But the key point here that I think Tom, Ian, and myself are raising is that what the Sutton Trust are suggesting is that thousands of A-level pupils are not being given any work by teachers, even the ones who have access to online internet. And that's what I think we're just trying to understand. I don't find that in my own constituency at all. And I think Tom has said this. This is why I was genuinely surprised to see this study. So I think there is a difference between whether the schools are providing the work and also whether or not children have online access to online technology. I'm going to come on to the to Ian and food hunger and free school meals, Ian and Fleur. So Ian, if you could start off, please.
All right. I'm afraid it's you again, Jeff. From your perspective, how well did the free school meal system work in the beginning with the new setup established by the government following the lockdown?
Well, I go back to my opening remark. We've tried to go into all of this with a spirit of generosity. That said, we're talking about something as significant as children going hungry here. So there is no doubt that in a kind of tradition of governments with big projects that are IT based, there were very significant issues early on with the free school meal voucher system, and we have continued to have pretty much daily conversations with the department expressing frustration. It felt to us that the system had improved last week as more resource was put in by Ease and Red, but I have to say, in preparation for today's meeting, I just sent something out to members on Friday saying, how are things going now? And I've had certainly a flurry of messages from people. An academy in Nottingham with 350 eligible children for free school meals, who just says it continues to be a problem for them to be able to get the vouchers. We currently have vouchers to the value of over £15,000 sitting in some form of suspended animation that we cannot get delivered to our parents. And what schools are therefore, in some cases, doing is making their own arrangements or falling back on previous arrangements. So I don't want to paint a catastrophic picture of what it looks like now, but there is no doubt from the responses I've had over the weekend from around, I would say probably 25, 30 members, that the frustration continues with that system. Yes,
certainly. I've had an awful lot of frustrations outlined to me, particularly by primary heads, which I know is not necessarily your remit, Jeff. But just for the record, and to be absolutely categorical about this, we're not talking about just initial glitches at the beginning. This is an ongoing set of problems.
It's an ongoing set of problems, without a doubt, whereby what we're finding are school business leaders, head teachers, deputy heads are getting up in the middle of the night or early in the morning when they think that the traffic to the website is going to make it easier for them, and trying to bulk buy the vouchers and doing all they can for that. And they wouldn't be doing that if the system was running without flaws.
Yeah. And are there situations where schools, from your understanding, are having to provide alternative solutions where the system has proved just to be unusable?
There are. There are examples of where there was either a locally based local authority system in place and the school has continued to use that. And there are cases where schools essentially are buying up food themselves and delivering it to households. I don't want to suggest in any way that that is representative. It is a sign, though, I think, of what some schools are having to do there. So I think learning from that, to have some sense that when we get to the half-term break and the summer, that something is going to be in place so that this isn't an example of where we are continuing to discuss technical problems and the frustrations, would at least give some reassurance that we've learned from the early part of the problems here.
I mean, I really do feel for staff in schools. I've had many examples passed to me where the system's inaccessible, literally hours spent waiting in queues only to be cut off, and in the end, again, as you've just said, schools trying to make alternative solutions by providing food themselves. I'm just wondering if you could keep us informed as a committee, Jeff, how you feel things are progressing with this, with evidence from your members as we go on.
Be very happy to do that, and I think members will be gratified because they're feeling pretty isolated in this, and yet they also feel, that the community is looking to them. As one member wrote to me over the weekend, whilst I accept that no system is perfect, this system has the biggest headache. As you know, families are hungry with no access to funds and stressed due to the nature of the lockdown, and they're looking to us to help them. So there is this real sense, I think, of a kind of emotive response from people, and a system that is feeling, for some of them, rather too impenetrable.
And lastly, have you had any significant evidence of the vouchers themselves? Once families have got them, that families can't redeem them because of the limited number of different outlets at which they can be used?
Well, a point that we heard earlier on is that for some families living on some estates, the place where the vouchers allow them to purchase the food isn't entirely appropriate. Now, I know the government is working on that. For example, it would be hugely helpful if the various co-op stores were able to use vouchers, but because of the nature of the co-op as an organisation, I gather that's proving problematic. So you can see that just in terms of access is an issue for some families. We've also had some examples of where families have taken their vouchers, gone around to do their shop, got to the end of the shopping, and the vouchers then have not been redeemable. There's been some problem with the vouchers itself, and that has left parents not just without the food, but feeling publicly humiliated by it. Again, I'm not wanting to paint an overly dramatic picture, but I think even if there's just one example of that, all of us would hugely regret it.
Fleur, do you want to come in at all?
Just a very practical follow-up to the comment you made about the co-op there, is that the co-op have told us that and the minister, as you say, was he said that he could have workarounds, and he would be able to redeem it from other shops. And the co-op have said that they would just like the schools to say, the minister to say, if the funding for those vouchers from other places would come out of the free school meals fund instead of the emergency fund, then they would be happy to go ahead. Is that, from what your point of view, the only barrier to going ahead? Or if the minister could say that the vouchers could be redeemed, is there anything else that's stopping that you know of? If not, we can just move on. But
my understanding with that is that it was an organisational issue. It was to do with the way the co-op is organised into different kind of local groups, which made it different from the government's point of view. Now, I don't know anything really about that. All we know is that the free school meal funds that our members have, they were told to continue to be paying who would normally be the provider of their food in school, so that this was all around additional funding. And what that's left school leaders in the position of is, if I cannot use the Edenred system, do I then use some of our existing budget to be able to make these arrangements and hope we can be reimbursed later? Even with that, there's some confusion about the reimbursal arrangements, but I think in the spirit of generosity, that's what those members who are frustrated by the national system are doing. And if we could get some sense that the co-op was part of it, that I think would be hugely welcome, however that was achieved.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And just to reassure you, we have raised all these issues with the Secretary of State and the Children's Minister quite a bit on the vouchers. I'm going to bring in Apsana, and hopefully we can get the other witnesses who've given up their time to answer as well. Apsana, please.
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Chair. Just to follow on from what's kind of been mentioned in the last few points, I mean, in terms of schools having to provide workarounds where the system is unusable, I mean, what further evidence are you sort of getting, or information are you getting about the kind of systems that schools are putting in place? I mean, I know certainly in my constituency, some schools have set up food banks themselves. And I just wanted to know whether you're also hearing this as well from your members.
Yes, I think there's a whole range of things. I think sometimes they've got local arrangements with supermarkets, sometimes done through the local authority. There are examples of where schools are putting together packs of food themselves and asking parents to come and collect them. And in fact, there's one school leader in London who said to me that actually that has proved a very important point of contact with families who were hard to reach, who are actually coming in and appreciating the fact that there is someone there who they recognise. So I think there is all kinds of resources and approaches happening, including in the independent sector. So, for example, in Somerset, a big boarding school in Somerset have, as they've put it, a team of 150 volunteers on a range of projects, including trying to get food out there. So I think we will probably look back and see a range of different schools, irrespective of type, doing a range of different things. But it all points to the fact that the centralised system is continuing to let people down somewhat.
Yeah, thank you. Do you have an indication of sort of how many additional families are eligible now for free school meals as a result of the financial difficulties caused by the pandemic?
That might be one better answered by the other two witnesses. I wouldn't be able to give any estimation. All I will know is that will be increasing.
Sure, we don't have a number on that specific point, but we do know is that there are significant numbers of families in the country who are experiencing real financial hardship right now, and that the school voucher programme, whilst well intentioned, has not delivered the results on the ground to some of these vulnerable children. We work with a number of families who have got no recourse to public funding, many of whom their parents have lost their jobs or they're on 0 hours contracts. And we know I do want to acknowledge the government have extended free school meals to this group of people. But what I would really want to encourage the government to do is to publicise that so that those families know that they're eligible for that. Because at the moment, for many of those families, they know they're closed out of the benefit system by dint of their immigration status. And they probably don't know that they're eligible for these school meals. And the other point I'd want to make is around the universal free school meals for the children, the youngest children in school. That offer is not being held up during COVID-19. So there are many families who had hitherto had free school meals as part of the universal offer who are now not getting that. And that's adding an extra £400 per child, roughly, per year onto their food bill. So one of the options could be to extend free school meal vouchers assuming we can get them to work properly, to the children who had the universal offer as well.
I would agree with Mark's comments, and we're certainly seeing lots of our families where we're actually providing them with food parcels through our emergency fund, and we're working with local food banks and with local supermarkets as well as the schools to supplement some of those food parcels with fresh produce, which is very, very difficult for our families to access, particularly if they're shopping in local stores that are probably not stocking anything other than processed foods. So there's a whole raft of issues around the impact on their physical health as a consequence of poor quality food that they may be accessing.
Thank you. And the point that you make about Mark about the no recourse to public funds is quite pertinent. Again, actually in my constituency, I mean, lots of families actually coming forward to schools to discuss the greater financial hardship that they find themselves in, and I guess the lack of support, but also the vulnerability around coming forward to various different bodies for fear of repercussion and consequences is actually really, really pertinent in many constituencies. I've got one final question, which is around breakfast club provisions. Do you think that is currently working well?
Again, I think we're working with a number of breakfast clubs running around across the country. Depending on the venue from where they are being used might affect whether families approach them or not, because again, it may be that they're at a distance from their home, but where they are working within a multi-agency network, it seems to work better because other professionals can encourage families to take their children to the breakfast clubs, and anything that provides food to children has to be welcomed.
One of the things we've encouraged the department to do is to encourage stories of good practice. There are a number of schools that we work alongside who are doing really creative things right now. We're working alongside one school who've got they've got 1,400 families, of whom 800 of those are in receipt of pupil premium. So it's an area of real deprivation and need. And that school has set up a food bank. They've got all kinds of extra things going on around the periphery of the school to encourage families to get the support that they need. So we've been encouraging the department to showcase examples like that, to show how schools can use their presence in the community to really support families who are frightened and scared right now, and who are anxious and who can't just make ends meet, who've just got too much month at the end of their money.
I think that that notion of spotlighting good practice is a very significant one, which I don't think we need necessarily in some cases to look to government to do. So, for example, if you look at that question of why is it that such a small number of vulnerable children are choosing not to attend or are not attending their school, what we've said to our members is, will you just have a look at how many are coming to your school? Because I think what we will find is there will be some schools that, because of what they are doing, who they've got there, the kind of activities they're offering, are seeing a higher number. And my guess is that what they're doing is something that absolutely grabs the interest of those young people. Let's share and celebrate that. It's my kind of particular mission for this week, is can we showcase what it is that is happening so that those vulnerable children are coming into school. And I think the more we can do that, the more it will empower other people to perhaps rethink some aspects of their practice. And that's something probably as a trade union with all of those members we can actually do ourselves.
Thank you, Fleur.
Thank you. I think this one is to Carol to start with. It's just following on from the comments you've just made about fresh fruit and veg availability. But do you think enough support is in place to ensure that all children are both getting enough to eat and enough of the food they need to thrive during this period?
I think it's very difficult for families, particularly those who are facing real financial hardship, to access fresh fruit, fresh vegetables, and fresh products generally. These are often supplied via the larger supermarkets and the local stores that they may be going to. Because if you're a single mum with 4 children, going to queue for a couple of hours outside an Asda is very different than going down to the local store, which you can go, the children can stay outside and you can go in. So accessibility to these are really difficult. And we've got an example in the Northeast where we've worked with a supermarket, local produce makers and ourselves to actually supplement food parcels from the food bank with fresh produce, so that we're absolutely giving children access to that. We're really concerned about the level of processed food that children will be eating during this period because it's cheap and it's easy to get hold of. And I think there's some real challenges for both the obesity levels, but also the physical health of children. And we really need to think about doing more to give children access to fruit and fresh veg.
Is there anything more you think the government could be doing on that to enable that to happen then?
I think the challenge is the way in which the voucher scheme directs people to large supermarkets and doesn't provide that. And actually, if we provided a greater degree of support to the food banks using fresh produce product people, then they could actually start to develop a better, broader range of packs than they currently have now, because they rely on people donating food, and people will donate largely processed food. If the vegetable producers could work with the food banks in a better way, we might get a more coordinated approach, and that might improve access to these things.
Thank you. My next one might be to Mark to start off with. What else would you like to see the government doing to further promote daily physical activity for all children to promote health development?
Perhaps I can answer that question with something we've been encouraging the department to do for quite some time, which is to communicate directly to children. I was in my local supermarket just down the road on the day that schools closed, and there were 14 or 15 children in front of me wearing a local school uniform who were all terrified of what was going on. Their brains were short-circuiting. Nothing that they'd ever come across in their lives prepared them for this. But to be fair, I felt pretty much the same. And one of the children spotted me, and he's a neighbour, and he said, "Mark, hey, you run a charity that helps young people. What do you think?" And I said, "Well, look, we're going to come through this. We're going to come through this. We will come through it. We always come through these things as a country, and we will follow the government's advice. We will do what we're advised to do, and we'll stay healthy and come through." And I suppose what I'd want to say is I would want to encourage the government to communicate directly to children and young people. The Norwegian Prime Minister did a fabulous press conference inviting questions from the public, from young people to come through. I had a tweet just last week from a young person who tried to ask a question at the government's daily press conference that we're now encouraged the public to ask questions, and she wasn't allowed to ask that question because the system told her she was under 18. So I think it's really important that government directly communicate to children, and part of that can be to say, look, it's really important you eat properly, it's really important that you take your exercise, it's really important that you keep in touch with your friends, so that children know that it's okay not to be okay right now. There are a lot of very scared children in this country, and I would really want to encourage the government to find a creative way to communicate with them directly.
Could I make a comment on that as well, if that's all right? I think, at some point what we're going to have is the opportunity of a kind of educational rebirth as children start to come back in and regain that sense of community. And one of the things I hope from government, but also from all of us, is that we stop defining education quite so narrowly by a set of metrics, and that we realise the importance of physical activity. And there are children in year 5 and year 6, so that's the top of primary, who will not have done any PE and sport because of an obsession with getting them ready for those Key Stage 2 exams, and children in year 10 and 11, where it's too easy to say, right, let's do some catch up for your English and your maths, we'll take you out of PE. Now, I was the head of a sports college, and I saw the utterly inclusive and empowering sense of what sport could do. As someone who doesn't like sport myself, I saw what it did, and I saw the importance of it. And what we know from the Youth Sports Trust and from Sport England is at the moment 10% of children apparently are doing no physical exercise a day, 38% are doing less physical activity. And I just hope that the sense of a broad and balanced curriculum with physical activity alongside hand-in-hand mental activity is something where we will recalibrate the English education system somewhat.
Yeah, it's an important point about this catch-up and when it would happen, and if it would squeeze out other subjects such as sport and activity, also creative subjects, I guess, as well, like music. Just coming back to the food side of things, what specialist support would you like to see for parents and carers of children and young people with eating disorders, especially? Who would like to answer that? Carol or Mark, do you have any comments on that?
I think, we don't work specifically with children with eating disorders, but they are a high-risk category of children in the current crisis. There'd be no doubt about that. And the specialist support that's available to them pre-crisis was very limited. I guess it's virtually non-existent now. So I think the government really needs to think about not just that group of children, but for example, children who have particular food allergies or require particular specialist diets. We're picking up that families where children have a particular dietary need are really struggling in the current climate because they can't get access to the food that they need, the detailed food, because that's just not available in the same quantities. So I think there are individual groups of children who have food related challenges, whether that's eating disorders or special diets, who will be falling by the wayside and will be falling into crisis, and families who will be very worried about those children and young people. So their anxiety levels and the tensions within the household will increase as a consequence of that.
I would want to concur with that. And we all know, that mealtimes can be a real time of conflict in families at the best of times. And I think being in lockdown is making that more challenging. And we work with young people who have a number of self-harming issues going on in their lives. And we know that for many of those young people, control is something that they struggle with. And because the world in which we're now in, we all feel a certain sense of lack of control. Food intake is one thing that those children feel that they can control. And that's why eating disorders, I think, will be significantly more challenging in this environment. Alongside that, we know that referrals to mental health services are going down. And part of that, we've encouraged the government to communicate, because we think some parents think that mental health services are closed because many schools are closed to children. And so we're really concerned that when this lockdown is over, there's going to be a significant spike in mental health issues with young people at the other end. And if I could just make one point on this, many organizations such as my own and that of like Carol's, we're charities, and we're suffering a huge hole in our budgets right now. And I'm really concerned. We'll my own organization will limp through this to the other end. I'm fairly certain of that. But lots of other charities won't. And I'm really concerned that when the lid does come off lockdown and there is a significant spike in mental health issues in the lives of children and young people, that many of the support structures in the community that were there to support those young people won't be there. And that really concerns me. And that's why this all connects together. There's issues around mental health, physical health, well-being, and also the state of the charity sector, because we need strong civil society to help put the country back together again once the lid comes off this lockdown period.
I think that's a point very well made there by Mark. And what I think it's too early for us to know in terms of the impact on eating disorders. We do know, as Mark kind of alludes to, over the past 2 years, our SEND specialist says eating disorders have shot up, 25% of which are male. Now, what we know is when schools start to reopen, it's likely to be with smaller numbers of young people on a phased approach. That is the perfect opportunity to kind of re-establish the social side of the way you bring people together around food and so on. And it's something which, again, has been squeezed to the margins a little bit in schools too often. And maybe there's a chance here to rebuild in something at the heart of the school community, which is bringing young people with adults together, enjoying eating together, and starting to get a sense of normalization at some point.
Just before I bring in Christian on this, you mentioned about it's likely that there'll be phased openings. Do you have a view about when schools should open? I know you've done a blog, Jeff, quite early on, a few weeks ago, on this. And do you have any views about when schools should open and which schools should open first and how that phase opening should work?
I think the level of anxiety is incredibly significant. It's got more significant, I think, over the weekend, because if you're working in health, or indeed if you're working in the police, you know that there are certain physical risks that you take on when you do that job. Becoming a teacher, a teaching assistant, clearly all of that stuff is beyond your control. And therefore, the first part of all of this has to be, we will need very strong scientific reassurance as to what, for example, social distancing means in a school context, what PPE. We're expecting to have a decision about whether there's a lightening of the lockdown this week. And it seems to us from our talks with the department that to give school and college leaders 3 weeks to then think through what are the logistics of that is sensible. I think the thing we know is that whenever this happens, you're not going to have all of your staff in school, because some of those staff are themselves vulnerable to the virus, or they live in families which are vulnerable. And that then leads you to think, well, if you're not going to have all of your staff, you won't have all of your children. Therefore, which ones would you bring in? Now, there's a logic to saying, well, surely you would bring in the most disadvantaged and the most vulnerable first. But as we already know, they're the hardest to get to. And I think at a time when there is anxiety to say, right, let's have all of you disadvantaged and vulnerable children, and that's quite a big sell in some ways. And therefore, I think the increasing thinking for secondary is to think in terms of cohorts. Which children initially would you bring in? That's why year 10, who are in the middle of their GCSE, year 12 are in the middle of their A-levels, wouldn't make sense. It probably makes sense in primary to look at year 5, who need to finish their primary curriculum. But those year 6s at the top haven't had closure of their primary time. They haven't said goodbye to their primary teacher. And you could do something around that. And I think it might be that there's a kind of 2 parts to this, that initially you use that cohort approach. But if time allowed you, wouldn't it be great nationally if you could essentially, through a rota business, bring every child in before the summer holiday starts, so that every child has some experience of the normality and routines of school and seeing familiar people there, even if it's only for 2 days, because I think that would make September so much easier if we have some kind of normality there. And that phased approach, therefore, around who would you do it and when would you do it, seems to me the earliest point would be the 1st of June.
And you would say a cohort approach rather than, let's say, primary schools opening first and so on?
I think the primary opening first is very problematic, actually, because if we know that you're going to have reduced numbers in school, and if there's going to have to be some form of social distancing, you know, if you're an early years teacher, for example, those and that child falls over and, you know, you cuts their leg open, the idea that you're not going to be able to go and help them will be very difficult. Now, that's why I start with year 5, actually, because it might be they're just old enough to understand what social distancing mean and they like a bit of formality to it. And it would also seem to me bizarre if you opened all the primaries and had your secondaries sitting empty, when actually there are some young people who would benefit hugely educationally. So there is an argument in primary for it being done in a different way, that is through families, because if you're a parent who's got a child in year 2 and a child in year 5, you're not going to gain much if just the year 5 goes in. All of that detail we're talking with the department about, but it's all predicated, as you can understand, on the expertise that other people have got to reassure people it's safe, because that's not just about the staff, it's about the parents saying, yes, I'll send my child there.
And just finally, on the PPE, if schools do open, are you confident that the right PPE guidance is there and that teachers in vulnerable settings, particularly those who are looking after children with behavioural difficulties, will have the access to the right PPE?
I think it's difficult to know, and I think there are mixed messages as to whether PPE will be necessary, who needs it. I think there's a lot of detail on that, but I also worry as to whether parents themselves, if they're seeing teachers wearing some forms of masks and gowns and so on, would be thinking it's the right time to send my child in. So and that's why the surveys of parental perception over the weekend are so significant, I think. And it's not just whether we think it's right, it's whether we have reassured the public. And I think there's a lot of work still to do on that.
Mr. Chair, may I make a point on ending lockdown?
Yeah, please.
I'm just very conscious that the ending lockdown is very much focused on schools and teachers at the moment. And I'd quite like to move the focus to what ending lockdown means for children. And we'd want to encourage schools to be doing well-being checks on children as they come back into school, because there will be a whole pile of things will have happened. We know that for many children at risk, school is one of the first places where issues are spotted. And there are going to be a number of children coming back to school after this big, long gap with a whole lot of things that happened in their lives that school won't have known about. That could be people who they may have lost loved ones to this awful disease. There may be significant mental health issues that have come down from lockdown. There could be all the curriculum catch-up stuff. There could be a whole plethora of issues in these children's lives that we're going to need to get a handle on quite quickly and make sure the right support is put in place for those children, particularly children from the.
So how would that work in practice? How would a wellbeing, give me an example, what would that mean to a child who may be a child and a parent may be thinking of going back to school? What does a wellbeing test actually mean?
I think that means the child needs to sit with the teacher and return back to school and do a check-in in a way that's accessible to that child of what's happened in the months that they've been off, so that we can work out what support that child will need going forward. And also for many children, particularly younger ones, this is a big gap in their lives. I mean, proportionately in their existence, this is huge. And there's going to be a lot of children who will need help to reintegrate into being in a big crowd, having been in isolation for so long.
And I accept all that. I'm just trying to understand what a wellbeing test means in practice. Does it just mean a child sitting down with the teachers saying what's gone on? Does it mean a child sitting down with a counsellor in the school, or a mental health practitioner? I just want to understand.
Yes, I think that would be right. That would be what we would suggest, very much so. And it helps children feel that they are coming back in, being understood. And I think that's really important.
Okay, thank you. Christian, you've been waiting very patiently. Are you there?
Yep, still here, Chair.
Thank you. Please, far away.
Probably the last questions in regards to food. So is school holiday hunger over the summer holidays likely to be exacerbated by COVID-19, do you think?
Simple answer, I think, is yes, sir. I think it is. And I think we would like to hear the government extend the free school meals provision over the summer holidays, because we know, even leaving the pandemic to one side, we know that there is holiday hunger anyway in the lives of the poorest children in this country. And so I think the particular issues around COVID, the perhaps loss of earnings in families, job insecurity, and also the higher costs of children being at home mean that there's a significantly higher risk of food hunger. And so we'd really want to encourage the government to extend the free school meals provision over the holidays, and also to extend it to those children who would have had the universal free school meals as well.
I would concur with Mark's comments there.
Okay, well, that's certainly answered my follow-up as well on that one. I guess my final question on that thread would be, what are likely to be the long-term health implications of a period of food poverty on children and young people?
Well, we know that poverty generally leads to poor health outcomes, and we are very concerned about the long-term impact that food poverty will have on children, particularly those in primary school, but not exclusively to those. Their physical health may be affected, and their ability to then therefore learn. So going into school hungry, you're not going to learn. And so I think there are a number of different issues, and that wellness and wellbeing test that Mark referred to, actually understanding where they are and how ready they are to learn, so not forcing them into catch up when they may not be even ready to learn, it will be really important. So I think there will be long-term impacts. It'll be predominantly on physical health, but it may also have an impact on their mental health.
Chris, may I come in on that, please, as well?
Yeah.
We publish the Good Childhood Report every year, and we're in the middle of doing the research for that right now. And we've put a whole series of questions into the field around the impact on children's physical and mental health and well-being around COVID. So we'll be in a better position to answer some of those questions a little bit down the line. Now, normally we publish Good Childhood in August, but we're going to publish that particular strand around COVID as soon as the info lands with us, and my team have dissected it. We will publish it immediately so it can help inform policy going forward. But we know that children who live in poorer households struggle with poorer physical and mental health. We also know from our research that children who experience loneliness have significantly lower levels of emotional and physical well-being. And we know as well from our research that families who experience poverty, the children are more likely to experience loneliness. So there is going to be, I think, a significant long-term impact on children. And so that's why I've offered a whole range of things the government could do more in this evidence today, but I do want to say I think the government have responded really well on a whole range of issues, and they've been very open to hear from organisations such as mine and Carol's, who are on the front line. And one of the things we're doing every week is we're collating information from frontline practitioners from across the sector and across charities, so we can be clear on what our frontline practitioners are telling us about the needs that they're experiencing in young people at this complex time.
Okay, thank you. Ian.
Yeah, just quickly following on from that, Chair, I'm just wondering if our two people from the charities in particular could tell us if they think that the government support for the charitable sector has been sufficiently wide-ranging to provide adequate support to maintain the important frontline services that you're engaged in. Because, for instance, I'm aware that Action for Children, for instance, has suspended an agreed pay increase for some of its staff already. So, that would indicate to me that there are financial problems.
Absolutely, there are, and some charities will go to the wall. Like Mark, we think we might ride this out, but that's not to say it won't be challenging. So we have staff who are working in children's homes, in homes for children with disabilities, who are on the front line, going and visiting families. And we have had to suspend our pay award this year because the risk financially to us is significant. We've deferred it. We may be able to meet it going forward, but it is a real challenge. And it's made more difficult for us when like the Welsh government is saying that they'll pay, social care workers an extra £500 to, reward them for what they do. Well, that's great. Are they going to give it to us as a charity to also give to our staff? So there is the social care sector has suffered significantly for a number of years, and we are the safety net of a creaking social care system and a social security system that's under significant strain. And if charities fail to survive this crisis, the social care system will fail to cope post it.
As a supplementary to that, Carol, and in that case, you've talked about, your staff working in particular settings and in outreach. Have you been able, where necessary, to secure the appropriate PPE for staff in such settings and doing outreach work?
We have been fortunate. We've had a lot of support from our local authority partners and the local resilience forums. It's been a bit haphazard, to be fair. In some places that's working really well, and in other places it's not working so well. And that in part is because the local resilience forums don't always recognise us as a social care provider because we're a charity. But we currently we're doing okay. The longer this goes on, the more problematic that will become. But we're having to source that ourselves.
Mark, and yourselves, have you had similar sort of experience?
This is a really hard time for the third sector, and our first priority has been to ensure that all of the young people and children we support around the country, we continue to support them. So in the first 3 weeks of this crisis, we redesigned, reconfigured, reshaped every single service we provide to children to ensure that we could provide it in a way that was consistent with the government's new rules. That's involved, shipping huge swathes of IT kit around the country. It's involved getting IT kit into the hands of some of the most vulnerable children for whom they didn't have it. But we're trying to work out now, are there limitations on the work that we do? Because, I've had members of my team, some of my younger members of my team who flat share in small accommodation in cities where there's no outside space, having to go out and sit in the street to make a phone call to a child in trouble. So we're doing our level best to ensure every service we provide to children continues. And I welcome the government's furloughing team. I really do welcome it. But if I furlough team, we're mothballing the organisation rather than mobilising it at a time when we need to be supporting more children. So we're riding this. We've cut everything we possibly can. I'm giving a chunk of my salary back to the organisation. We're all doing everything we can to try and help the organisation through, but it's really tough. So the government have announced a support package. Hopefully we'll find out this week if my own organisation, and Carol should as well, if we're able to benefit from that, and we hope we are. But be under no illusion, there will be a significant number of charities won't make it through this crisis, and that's got to have implications for civic society on the other side. But right now, my team are focused on helping young people.
Thank you.
Can I ask? Sorry, Robert. Yeah, can I ask? In coming through this and following from the questions that Christian put to you, what needs to be done to ensure that the health of a generation of children is not too adversely affected by the social distancing measures, but also by these food shortages that we've heard of?
One thing the government doesn't do, which it could do, is it doesn't measure children's well-being. We measure children's well-being. In fact, my organisation is probably doing the most significant measurement of children's well-being. But we're really encouraging government to measure children's well-being. We can measure adults' well-being, but not children's, because we're going to need to measure children's well-being even more so now, so we can see what the implications are of this period of lockdown on children's mental health in 2, 3, 5 years' time. So then we can make the right and informed and smart policy choices to help those children thrive in the future.
Can I just ask you how you define well-being, and just again, if you could just explain how specifically your charity is measuring it?
The well-being of a child is a matrix of issues from the environmental issues around that child. It's around that child's sense of happiness and hope. It's around their physical and mental health. So it's a sort of a basket of things you put together to measure a child's thriving. That's more than just economic data or school attainment. And I'll very happily write to the committee with how we measure it and how we put that together. We've been working with ONS and hopefully encouraging them to do likewise for children.
So you're doing it via data?
Yeah.
Right.
I will, and by surveys with families and children directly.
And behavioural insights as well?
I will have to confirm with my statisticians and come back to you, sir.
Okay. And what I just want to try again understand is how you do it in practice. I mean, because given that you have such a big basket of wellbeing measures that you've just set out, who does the wellbeing measure? Because you can't just get a doctor to do it, because that would just focus on medical issues. You can't just get a teacher to do it. I mean, how does this work in practice? Sorry to ask you again, but I'm just not clear.
May I write to you on that, sir?
Sure. If you could, because it sounds like a great idea. I'm just trying to understand what it means for a constituent in a school in Harlow. What that means for that young person who's maybe having a lot of troubles at the moment and his well-being is poor according to your basket, but who would actually remember it? Ian, thank you. Ian, do you have any more questions?
Yes, I do. I'm just wondering, is there anything specifically you think should be done to put in place better support for children and young people whose physical health conditions prevent them from attending their usual educational settings? Can you get that?
Yeah, sorry. I think the special educational needs and children who have physical disabilities, they were going to need some very specific, tailored follow-up support, I suspect, when they go back into school. It will be very difficult for special schools, and I'm sure Jeff could comment more on this, in terms of that social distancing. If you've got children in wheelchairs and some children who are requiring a lot of physical support by the staff in the school, then managing those, their return back is going to need some very careful planning. And they will have longer term physical needs. We've got a young woman, for example, who requires a bodysuit for her posture. She has grown out of the suit that she's currently got. The supplier has a suit available to her, but obviously cannot go to the home to fit it to make sure it's secure for her. And it will be examples like that where children's physical disabilities will have been further compromised because of the period of lockdown, and how organisations that support them with their physical and their mobility equipment will need to think about how they work with schools and with health to enable those children to get the equipment that they need, and to make sure that that equipment helps them in terms of where they may have had further damage during the lockdown.
Lastly, from me as well, Chair, to Jeff in particular, what's your view on the government's current measures to keep vulnerable children and children of critical workers safe from exposure to the virus if they're still attending school? And I did pick up earlier on the question of vulnerable children causing confusion, that terminology, and there has been an element of mixed messaging. Stay home, stay safe, protect the NHS, save lives, and yet we want youngsters who are vulnerable to attend school if we can get them there, and also the youngsters of those critical workers.
I think that the guidance we've had so far has been very comprehensive. Part of the problem, in fact, for leaders is that overnight more guidance comes out and you have to navigate your way through that. The trouble is that we're working with very small numbers in the majority of schools at the moment, and therefore the whole social distancing, for example, is much more straightforward. And you're doing it with particularly those key workers, children who realise they're part of a national mission. They're happy to be there. I think all of this raises questions about what does it look like when we start bringing more young people in, and how do we reassure our staff and reassure children? And it does seem to me that the notion of social distancing as a definition appears to be changing at the moment, just listening to the news this morning. And I think we'll just want absolute clarity on what does that mean in a school context, where you might have narrow corridors, and therefore to move children from classroom A to classroom B to classroom C is going to need some pretty careful managing there. That's why we'll need those 3 weeks to do the planning. And I just say one other thing, actually, just listening to all of this conversation, because you've just made me reflect on whether one stepping stone for all of this, which would be good for the child at the heart of it, but good for their parents as well, is something you would do as a secondary head. When the new year 7s came in, before they came into school, you would have a meeting with their tutor and their parent, and you would talk about how they're doing and so on and so forth. And maybe that transition point, a conversation which is doing something a little bit like Mark was suggesting around just checking on their well-being before you start bringing them into kind of formal learning, might be a very reassuring next step, which would do some of the things that we've been talking about in this conversation, whilst keeping numbers fairly low in the first instance.
Jeff, your video has gone, but it's not a problem. We
Oh,
can hear you well, but just to let you know.
So
Can I just, before I bring in David, just very quickly, I understand that the in Australia, the health minister there has suggested that schools may open, but they also may close and open up again on individual schools, because he says if teachers get this virus, then the school will have to be closed for a few days and disinfected and self-isolation for others who are near the teacher. Would you see that happening in the UK, or do we just don't know yet?
Oh, A, we don't know, but B, I really hope it isn't like that, because, you know, the young people, all of us, need some kind of stability. And I think if what that means is that we take an incredibly cautious approach in the early days, so that if the decision were made, and what we were saying is, well, let's bring, you know, if I was still ahead and we're bringing our year 10 students in, for example, well, the school I ran here in Bury St Edmunds had 350 year 10. So the notion of bringing 350 and then 150 year 12s all on the same day, that seems to me quite a big ask. And that's why I think all of these conversations are helping us just to think through, how do you do that on a phased approach?
If the year 10 teacher falls ill and he or she has been in contact with all the other teachers in the common room who have come in and the support staff, what then happens?
Well, that's why I think we would have to look at this from the beginning, that you're not going to move to a normal curriculum straight away, because if you're a year 10 child, you'll have a history teacher, a geography teacher, a maths teacher, a science teacher. And as you say, if your geography teacher's not there, who's going to step in to that? And it might be that the nature of the curriculum in the early days is a pretty stripped back one. And maybe we give more emphasis to PE and sport, hoping our PE and sports teachers are all right to teach it. But I think a different kind of curriculum to do the resocialization in the summer might be a useful stepping stone to whatever the autumn term might look like.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in David. Just before I do that, we may have to pause the committee literally from about 10:58 to 11:04, because there's going to be some online test voting for all the MPs. And I don't know about the opposition, but we've been told that we've got a 3-line whip on it.
Yes, we
so
have.
You've all as well. So all of us will just have to vote. It should take very little time, and we'll be back about, if we say we can be back by 11:03 or something, I think. David, thank you for waiting patiently.
Thank you, Chairman. Perhaps for time, I'll just combine the two questions. And these are both about the issue of mental health support once schools reopen. So I'd be interested in your view, firstly, around the risk assessment that needs to be done to ensure that it is a safe environment. And do you have a view about what resources or funding should be available? And in particular, how should the balance be struck? I'm hearing some schools, for example, saying they want to take initiative and open during the summer holidays at their own initiative, not as a matter of government policy, to balance between academic catch-ups and supporting children's mental health as they get back to that new normal.
Is that for me?
Jeff and colleagues with a view as well.
So what we think is that young people will be feeling a range of different emotions, as we all are at the moment, but anxiety being the biggest of those. And they will be anxious when they hear that schools may be reopening, and they will be anxious if they hear that schools aren't reopening. So we know that. And therefore, I think it's worth reminding ourselves that one of the most important functions schools have is the reassurance of younger people seeing an older generation who kind of help to calm them and to talk about things. And I think there will need to be some guidance in terms of what might be appropriate things that we do when we come back to school. I was when I was head, in 10 days, a 10-day period, 3 people in the school were killed, 2 children and a member of staff, separate incidents. And I remember saying to the local authority, so do we need a team of counsellors here for the community? And they said, no. You actually need the routines of school life and the reassurance of conversations and events which kind of allow young people to reflect on, so grief will be one important thing. I think we'll just need guidance on what is the balance of the routines that we would normally have that help to ease people back in, but also what particular conversation and events. And I go back to my previous point of every young person with their parents perhaps being able to have a conversation with their tutor or their teacher in primary school might be one really important resocializing approach to all of this.
I mean, I think that there will be some children who will need some specialist support when they come out of this, who may have had mental health challenges before the crisis, and those may well be compromised as a consequence. And certainly they won't be in a position to do any educational catch-up if their mental health is compromised. So I think there will be a need for some specialist support. There are a range of programmes out there that can do that, either one-to-one or group work. And we've got, like Mark, we've reshaped a lot of our service delivery, and we've got a mental health group work programme that we're now offering online. So I think there will be a need for some specialist resources, and we know that the CAM service is perhaps under strain and isn't necessarily the right resource for some of the support that young people will need.
I would completely concur with that, and obviously schools play such an important role in identifying mental health issues in young people and helping signpost them. So the absence of that in those young people's lives for this season is very, very difficult. Some of the practical things we've suggested government could do, I alluded to this a little bit earlier, was that to help schools help parents know that the existing mental health support services that are already in place or were in place before COVID are still in place, and that they can access them, and so that they don't have to feel they have to wait till schools reopen. That's one. And secondly, we would encourage government to help local authorities put in place. We've called it like a mental health recovery service, or some sort of budget in addition to what they currently have, to focus specifically on helping young people whose mental health has deteriorated during this period. But I know from our own team who are supporting young people on the front line right now that yes, we have a lifeline to those young people digitally, but it's not the same. And so I was talking to a colleague the other day who's supporting a young person, a young LGBT person, who's living in a household where that young person feels unable to talk about the issues that they're struggling with because their parents don't know that they're LGBT. And it's finding ways to help that young person process all of that in a safe way. So government targeting resource specifically to schools to help with mental health after this would be hugely welcome.
Okay. May I just come back briefly on the question about the risk assessment? Where do you think responsibility lies? Is it the department should be issuing guidance, particularly given that we have a mixed economy, multi-academy trust leaders perhaps taking one view, the Department for Education may be taking another one?
I think there would definitely be a need for guidance on this because, as we keep saying, these are unprecedented times, and I know from all those years in schools that being able to find specialist support, CAMS, for example, has, as the committee will know, been very problematic. So I think just as a starting point, what does a kind of identification process look like and how might it work? Who might do that in schools? Could we have a look at some good practice for that? Again, we've got some thinking time to start skilling ourselves up with all of that, but I think we would expect the department to provide the insights there, and we would then think through the logistics. And I think the point about additional resources targeted by the school would be very important for that.
Thanks. David, have you finished that, or?
Yep, thank you. That's helpful.
Chair, can I just jump in?
Yeah, David, I'm just going to bring in David Johnson. You want to say something?
Yeah, thank you. Carol, can I just go back to your point on CAMS? Because I think I know what you're talking about, but I can imagine it might be the obvious focus for government in this period. And what specifically you think would be the issues if the government does focus on CAMS to deal with the mental health support that is needed specifically for this crisis and post this crisis?
The CAMS service is already creaking. Referrals to CAMS are really challenging, and they tend to have a high threshold criteria that excludes a lot of children. So if they're not presenting with a mental health disease, if you like, then or a diagnosis, then often the CAMS service won't support. And for a lot of these children and young people, it's developing their anxiety, it's leading towards depression, it's a number of those things. And actually there are a lot of organisations and some schools themselves employ counsellors, but there are a range of services that can do very specific pieces of group work or individual support to children and young people who don't require a CAM service, and focusing on CAMs excludes those children from those resources.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else want to comment on that at all?
Oh yeah, can I just ask a question about that?
Please.
Thank you. So I talked last week with someone who works for CAMS, and she's unable to go back and work there because she's a key worker, but her husband isn't. So her children can't go back to school, and so she can't do those confidential conversations that she would need to have. She's got colleagues who are sitting in cars apparently and not able to go back. I wonder what impact that's having on your staff as well. And would there be any case, do you think, for asking the government guidelines? I mean, I know it's all about public health and that's the primary thing, but those government guidelines to slightly extend to key workers who have a partner at home but can't get to work otherwise, and the impact that she says this is having a significant impact on our local mental health services and staff being able to go back and support children with the CAM service. I wonder if you've got any comments on that.
I think Mark has already alluded to the fact that, you know, both of our organisations have young, you know, staff who are young and are in house shares, and we're seeing the same thing, that some of our staff are going out into their cars, or they're going, you know, down to the park to sort of create a space where they can confidentially talk to children and families. So it is a real challenge. I mean, I myself, I live in my niece is a social worker for a local authority, and the two of us are in opposite ends of the house so that she can have the space that she needs to be enable her to work. Now, we're in a very privileged position to be able to do that. A lot of you know, young social workers and care workers won't have that capacity because they're in, you know, shared accommodation, and or they're, you know, in a household where they've got a partner who isn't a key worker. So I think there are some real challenges that make it much more of a difficult position for some of those workers to do what they want to do for the children and young people, because that's their focus.
I think there's a very, very important principle there, which I hadn't actually thought about, which is that this is moving in different phases, isn't it? And the definition of, so who do you need in phase one as key workers may actually be different as to what you need in phase whatever we're in now. And I think there is something around that. If what we need to do is to make sure that those additional staff and additional services to support children's mental and physical health, whatever it might be, they need to be available. I think there's a very strong argument for saying to the government, let's revisit what is the definition of how the key worker system works.
Yeah.
Tom, if you could just ask Jonathan's questions, please.
What should the government do to support disadvantaged children whose mental health is likely to be disproportionately affected as a result of the pandemic?
Mr. Chair, I think we were getting towards that answer in the last question, and we talked about a little bit around CAMS, and the Children's Commissioner issued a report earlier this year which shows progress was being made in waiting times going down. However, our experience is that provision is patchy across the country, and our worry is that this crisis will see a spike, as I said earlier, of referrals at the other end. And if we don't handle this wisely, we think we will risk the progress we've made in reducing waiting lists, and could actually contribute to a long-term decline in young people's mental health. So we're suggesting the two things really. One, that in local areas, schools, NHS trusts, etc., have a local recovery plan in place around children's mental health, and B, that additional funding I talked about earlier, sort of like a COVID recovery fund for mental health, so that young people can access the support that they need. And I think if government could do those two things and encourage that local action plan, we might be able to stem some of the significant decline that people are predicting at the other end.
Also, what would you say the risks are of increased social media exposure on children and young people's mental health during this period?
Well, we talked earlier about the safeguarding issues around social media, and those have been there for some time. And obviously, I think there's evidence that that's got worse during this situation. But also it's important to say there are positive benefits to social media at this time, particularly for children who are feeling very isolated and feeling very alone, that it's a tool to help them keep in touch with their friends and with each other. But we do know, all of the research shows that excessive use of social media is linked to poor mental health in young people and low sense of self-worth and well-being. And so it's important to not throw the baby out with the bathwater on social media. There are significant risks, but also there is some benefit to it at this particular time.
Could I just ask one more question? And I think it has been partly touched upon during this session, but I think it's also worth noting that, the dimension here with regards to children with special educational needs. Yes, the more severe forms of special educational needs, but also some of the less severe forms, for example, those with dyslexia and dyspraxia, who often form particular attachments to certain teachers who they have very good relationships with, and they process things in their own way, and they form coping mechanisms, often at school, to help them deal with challenges. And actually, one of the challenges of having dyspraxia is that you don't tend to be very good with computers, which is one of the things that I'm aware of being dyspraxic myself. So I just think that when it comes to those wellbeing sessions that you've suggested, and I think that's an absolutely the sort of thing that should be happening when we're over this, that there should be a sit down of every single child, not just those who are vulnerable. But I think in the mind of schools and the mind of the government, that there needs to be a consideration for, there needs to be a dimension for those with special educational needs, because a lot of them, it can be feel an added anxiety for them, because they'll feel their sense of self-worth, their sense that they're falling behind, they're struggling with these new arrangements, and the coping mechanisms that they had in place at school, often involving relationships with particular teachers, have been undermined, and that will be causing them additional mental pressure and anxiety.
I would agree with everything that Mark has said, and that you yourself have said, Tom. I think particularly for children with special education needs, that relationship is critical, and that's been a key factor in them losing some of their, as you say, coping mechanisms. So it will be a real challenge, and particularly for children with autism, helping them understand social distancing in a school will be a real challenge for schools.
I think I would just note, if people haven't seen, that the Oak Academy of Resources has today launched a range of what they're calling specialist resources, written by therapists and by teachers, and that was an important message, that whatever your background, you also should be entitled to that national resource, and I think we would welcome that. And I think all of this speaks to the kind of pupil premium bonus, in order that we can then target additional resources at those children who will need to do the most catching up with people who are best placed to be able to do that.
Tommy, done? Has anyone else? Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, I just would say that I know that there is. I spoke to the curriculum director at the Oak Academy on Friday, following a meeting we had last week, and there had been some concerns raised of me that though there is a dedicated SEN section on the facility, there are some who are involved in working with children with dyslexia and dyspraxia who felt that it wasn't quite appropriate, and actually they can access mainstream. It just needs to be slightly differentiated. And actually, but I think that is being tweaked at the moment, and hopefully that will, yeah.
I think it's a tough call all the way around. There was some snarkiness over the weekend about some English resources. I'm an English teacher, and it let off the usual kind of Twitter spat. I think what's quite interesting about the specialist resources today is that the person who's collated those has written a blog, not at all defensively, explaining why these are not the answer to every child's needs. That would be very difficult without a teacher actually there to be able to assess them and to formulate the learning around them. But I think as a step forward, and symbolically, it's showing that those young people matter in a national academy as well.
Does any other member have any other question they'd like to ask?
That's for me, Robert. No.
Okay. Could I sorry, say again? No. Okay, could I just ask finally, I know you've mentioned some of the solutions and we proposed some in the aftermath, so I just want to end in the sense, looking forward, apart from some of the things that you have described already, if you could do one or two things to make sure that vulnerable children are looked after and catch up as the schools start to reopen again, and to potentially avoid a possible decade of educational poverty, what would you all do? Jeff, shall I start off with you?
Yeah, we've got an education system which is good at the moment. We've been saying to move it to world class. Then the 30% of children, the forgotten third, as we call them, need also to be recognised. And at the moment, our qualification system is problematic. We have comparable outcomes, which means that 30% of children have to get a 3, a 2, or a 1, and we have an accountability system, which means for too many head teachers, that they're following the accountability for their school rather than the individuals. So what I would hope might come out of this is us actually recognising that schools are an incredibly important place for the humanity, for the older generation to help the younger generation, and for us to declutter some of the things that are being expected of schools. That we could create a mission where more people want to go and teach and stay in teaching, where we can lighten the load of performance tables and Ofsted and all of that kind of thing. Make sure we update our curriculum so there is a digital curriculum for every school, not just in case this ever happened again, but actually it starts to create the link between what happens at home and here. And I think it might just be that there's a very optimistic next step in the development of our education system if we're prepared to use it in that way.
Just briefly, I noticed that colleges, and including my own in Harlow, they have been designing PPE equipment, and in terms of where they've got manufacturing centres for the students, and some of that has gone on in school. Does this not highlight the importance of design and technology, and that we need to reverse the decline in the take-up of design technology and make sure that it's seen as important as geography or history?
Absolutely. Design technology has been one of the most catastrophic areas. Yeah. So is home economics, the ability to cook. And actually making things is one of those key things that humans do, which is why putting the arts, putting those kind of subjects more centrally, rather than an obsession with the EBAC that we've had. And I think our FE colleges, again, will be rejuvenated by that.
Fleur, did you want to come in? No? Okay. Carol, and please, do you want to go first? And
I think I don't disagree with anything that Jeff has said. I think it is quite important that we look at the education system and make it more inclusive for all children. And one of the ways in which we can do that is actually listen to what children are telling us about their experience of the education system, and actually asking them to help or shape what the system should look like going forward. But for the most disadvantaged children, we also need to make sure that they don't fall through the gap, and that the focus on educational attainment doesn't disadvantage them further. And working with a range of professionals, so it's not just about the statutory sector, but all of the sectors can actually work together in a more inclusive way, in a more multi-agency way to help those families. And I would call on the government to rethink some of the decisions that have been made previously that have resulted in early help and early intervention services being decimated across local authorities.
Mark?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To sum up, I think if I could pick a couple of things that I would do, number one is if I could, I would encourage the government to increase child benefit, but for every child across the country right now, say £10 per child. Because there are significant numbers of children for whom the existing targeted pieces of support, they're falling through the gaps. And so that for this crisis, that would be one thing. Two, I welcome the government lifting the no recourse to public funding issue around free school meals, but I would really encourage the government for this season of this crisis to lift the whole condition, because there are going to be a whole number of families, many of whom perhaps are even key workers, who are experiencing real financial hardship because of this condition on their immigration status. Thirdly, I would find a way to communicate directly to children, to help them hear in language they understand that this is going to be okay. We're going to come through this as a country. We've come through stuff before, and to reassure them that the country will come through and be stronger on the other side. And finally, we're going to need in the years to come to target our resources acutely on the young people who have the most issues out of this crisis. And that's why I come back to measuring children's well-being, to ensure that we have the data to target those resources in the most appropriate way for the best impact for children, particularly the most vulnerable.
And you're going to send us more details of the well-being, as you said. In terms of communicating with children, okay, the government could have a question and answer session, But what else could happen? I mean, what do you mean by that in real practical terms? What does that mean?
It means that the government find a way, whether it's through the Oak Academy, and the Secretary of State was there at the opening assembly last week, which was great, but perhaps he could do a Q&A with those children through the Oak Academy. Perhaps we need to bring out people like Prince William or Stormzy or others to stand next to the PM and talk to young people directly about what's going on, and perhaps they can tweet in or send in questions that could be answered. It's just showing that the government is making a real concerted effort to hear the voices of children and respond specifically to their concerns.
Just on that, just as a thought, I mean, I think there's a principle which is very important. It seems to me that children might look to the kind of people who are part of the BBC offering, some of those celebrities. And I do think that message, it's now time to start thinking about going back to school. Here's what you will be thinking about, and having David Williams and others doing that. I think there's something really significant about that as part of this national transition.
I mean, that's very important. I know lots of children are doing the Joe Wicks thing from speaking to friends and constituents. Genuinely incredible individual, I think. I hope he gets a knighthood at the end of all this. What I and some others have suggested, and we raised this with the Secretary of State, is given the digital divide, and Mark, you've spoken of this, why not have the BBC or another broadcaster, but BBC is a trusted broadcaster, broadcast an education service for 2 or 3 hours a day while this is going on, and you would use your red button to choose what year group you were in, and so you'd move some of the online resources on the Oak Academy or whatever it may be to television, because we know that 95% of households have a television. Why can't we have a sort of Joe Wicks to do with education and skills on TV to help those children learn? What's your view about that?
Well, in fairness, the BBC has done that, and I think may well have felt slightly wrong-footed by the attention that went to the Oak Academy, when in fact they have developed very significantly their bite-size.
But that's mainly online. I'm talking about.
No, it's on the red.
TV.
It is on the red button as well, in fact.
Yeah, but it's a small amount.
Okay. Well, as a principle, that would be a much more universal offer if it was there via the television. I totally agree with that.
Yeah. And would you agree with that, Mark and Carol, a proper education service, perhaps a few hours on BBC Two every morning and evening or something, or children's BBC or whatever?
Mr. Chairman, anything that helps young people from disadvantaged backgrounds access education in an easier way would completely have our support. So, yes.
Okay.
And likewise from me.
Okay, could I thank you? In the beginning, I realised that I thanked all the heads and teachers and support staff for what they're doing, but we should also thank all your charity workers and volunteers as well, who are out on the ground doing an enormous job helping disadvantaged children, both of you and other children's charities. So a huge thank you from our committee to them as well, and really appreciate you being here today online. It's a private session, but it will be transcribed, and we will put the transcribed as best we can up on the House of Commons website, and we'll tweet part of it later. But I really appreciate you giving up your time today, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Order, the meeting is. Thank you.
Thank you.